Vrindavana Thakur, we know a little bit more about his background. Vrindavana Thakur, actually, we'll give a little build-up to it. In the town of Navadvip, we have this devotee we're all familiar with, Srivas Pandit. And Srivas had three brothers, Sripati, Sri Ram, and Sri Nalini. These were the three brothers, and there was four of them altogether. Sri Nalini was the eldest. Now, Sri Nalini had a niece, and that was Srivas's daughter. And, no, I'm sorry, it was Srivas's niece. It was the daughter of Nalini, excuse me, of Sri Nalini. And her name was Narayani. And when she was a very, very little girl, at the age of 4, this would have been during Mahaprabhu's pastimes, he would come to the home of Srivas, of course the Srivas Angam, the place where the kirtan carried on, and Mahaprabhu would say to this little girl, say, chant Hare Krishna, chant Hare Krishna. And sometimes they would say, oh, but she is just a little girl, she cannot chant. And Lord Chaitanya would say, why can she not chant? Anyone can take up the holy name, so chant Hare Krishna. And she would chant Krishna, 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 like that. So Lord Chaitanya would regularly give her the remnants from his plate. And so at the age of 4, she was getting the remnants of his plate. And this is actually quite appropriate, because in the Gauragonadesha Dipika of Kavi Karnapur, it mentions that in Krishna Lila she was Kalambika. And Kalambika had the opportunity of getting the remnants from Krishna's plate after she was one of the gopis, and this would be one of the benefits she would get from her service. So in this way, she was able to actually get the same experience in the pastimes of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. So Lord Chaitanya would order her, please chant, chant, and by this chanting, Krishna Prema would manifest. And so she was a very, very fortunate child. She would swoon, she would begin to chant, and then she would faint on the floor and roll in ecstasy, all at the age of 4 years old, just by eating the remnants of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and by being able to have the direct instruction from him. So in this way, Narayani grew and was eventually married. And very little is known about the marriage except the husband's name. His name was Vaikuntanath Vipra. And Vaikuntanath Vipra lived a village away. And the marriage took place, and she became pregnant quite quickly. And what happened was that during her pregnancy, she became widowed. Vaikuntanath Vipra passed away. Now, it was a different time period than we live in now. You don't simply make an arrangement and get another husband or find another man or whatever. This was it. You were married. That was it. Your husband dead. Boom. Finished. So it's a very difficult situation. So she returns to Navadvip, and Srivas arranges for her to have shelter at the home of Vasudev Dutt. Vasudev Dutt and his wife were, of course, moderately to-do Vaishnavas. They weren't very, very wealthy. So they arranged some shelter for her there. And Narayani, in her pregnancy, became their maidservant and lived in this, as it describes, a poverty-stricken condition. Very, very difficult life for her. You can imagine, very young girl, her hopes for family life, for peacefully raising Krishna-conscious children has now been, you know, amazing thing, because she got the mercy of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu at such a young age, but then the material side of her life was so difficult. So at any rate, in due course of time, the child took his birth, and this child was, of course, Vrindavana. That was his name as a young boy. And was very, very fortunate, because his mother, having from the age of 4 and then coming back to Navadvip while Mahaprabhu's pastimes were there, she was fortunate to have experienced many of these pastimes when she was growing up, and recited these pastimes to her son constantly. It mentions that she, let me just catch up here, that when Vrindavana Thakur took his birth, this would have been about 4 years after Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu took sannyas and had left from Navadvip. So she had a little bit of the latter pastimes, and then all of the younger pastimes, and she would constantly recite these to her son. So when Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu left this world, Vrindavana Das would have only been about 20 years old or so. So at that time, Vrindavana Das took Diksha from Nityananda. He actually became the last, and it says the most favored disciple of Lord Nityananda. That he was always the jewel in the eye of Nityananda, like that. So when Nityananda himself finally departed, then what happened was that Vrindavana Das went and took shelter of Mother Janava. She called him to the grand festival in Keturi, where there were so many different great Vaishnavas. All the great Vaishnavas at that time were there. And they all came. And at that time, he was able to take shelter there with Janava Mata and continue on in his appreciation for Nityananda and his development spiritually. So before Nityananda passed away, he had instructed Vrindavana Das that you should write the Chaitanya Bhagavat. You should write about the pastimes of the Lord. And these were primarily compiled from two sources. One was the similar sources of Lochan, and that is Murari Gupta's writings, and the other was the pastimes that he heard from his mother. So these were the two sources that he worked on. And we see that in reading the Chaitanya Bhagavat, that same mood is there of his deep humility, such as we found in the writings of Rupa and Sanatana Goswamis when they were writing different pastimes of the Lord. A very humble mood. Actually, Krishnadasa Kaviraja Goswami later speaks very highly of Vrindavana Thakur, understanding clearly that he is actually non-different than Vyasadeva himself. He's referred to as the Vyas of Chaitanya Lila by Vrindavana Thakur. And so he wrote this wonderful book, and the glories of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu were further told there. Now, there's a prayer that Krishnadasa Kaviraja Goswami has written, and it glorifies Vrindavana Thakur. I'd like to read that. The English translation of it is in poetry form. This is written by Krishnadasa Kaviraja Goswami, describing the glories of Vrindavana Thakur. Krishna's life was written in the Bhagavat of Vyas. The Veda Vyas for Sri Chaitanya was Vrindavana Das. Vrindavana Das has called his book Chaitanya Mangala. Whoever hears this book, no grave misfortune shall befall. Whoever reads and knows the glories of Chaitanya and Nitai, and knows what Krishna Bhakti is, and how it is, and why. His book contains the essence of the Holy Bhagavat, and shows what Krishna Bhakti is, and what Bhakti is not. An atheist who hears the Thakur's words will soon relent, and join the ranks of saintly men whose souls are heaven sent. No ordinary man can sing of God as he is sung. The Lord himself has spoken through the Thakur's holy tongue. I bow 1,000,000 times before the holy lotus feet of Sri Vrindavana Thakur, whose verses are so sweet, that one who reads them shall be freed from this dark and mortal earth. I bow 1,000,000 times before the place where he took his birth. So Krishnadasa Kaviraja Goswami glorifies Vrindavana Thakur very nicely like this. And there's an explanation as to his writing, because what we find in this transition that we have from Lochan to Vrindavana Das, and then from Vrindavana Das, as we'll see, to Krishnadasa Kaviraja Goswami, when Vrindavana Thakur is writing, as I mentioned, he's the disciple of Nityananda. So as he's writing about the early pastimes of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, and then gradually begins to bring the pastime of Lord Nityananda meeting with Sri Chaitanya in Navadvip, and then the pastimes of the two of them, he begins to absorb himself deeply in the mood of Nityananda, and begins to write quite a bit about Nityananda. Matter of fact, after writing this book, he writes the Nityananda Charitamrita, which is all the pastimes of Lord Nityananda. This is written by Vrindavana Thakur as well. Very, very wonderful book. So we were speaking about how Vrindavana Thakur, in his writing of the Chaitanya Bhagavat, as the part came where Nityananda and Lord Chaitanya met and they had their Navadvip pastimes together, being the disciple of Nityananda, he became very, very much absorbed in that way, and then spent a lot of time describing those things and did not dwell so much on the later pastimes of the Lord. on the what's called the Madhya Lila, or particularly the Antya Lila. And so in this way, it kind of almost, it's as if that part of Lord Chaitanya's pastimes were not presented, and this was greatly missed by many of the devotees. So what we have is that, he has written his Chaitanya Bhagavat, he's written his Nityananda Charanamrita, and we unfortunately do not find a lot of other information available. But one very, very important thing we do find, and this is an instruction from dasa Thakura that is very pertinent to all of us in the process of devotional service. He is very, very specific about not offending Vaishnavas. Let me find this here. Vrindavana Thakur writes as follows: if someone blasphemes a Vaishnava, even after being told how objectionable such blasphemy is, I will kick him in the head. This is the words of Vrindavana Thakur. Vrindavana Thakur says a lot of things like this. You'll find in the earlier parts when he talks about if someone says something blasphemous, they should be dunked in the Ganga repeatedly. Or if someone makes an offense, they should be slapped upside the head. He actually says things like this. So he says here that if someone blasphemes a Vaishnava, I will kick them in the head. Now, sometimes people use this to criticize Vrindavana Thakur not being very magnanimous. But Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur gives a very nice explanation of this. And he explains that what this means is that if the dust, a particle of the dust from the feet of Vrindavana Thakur touches the head of such a blasphemer, this is their only hope of correcting their offense. And by that dust from his feet, they actually have the hope of being released from that offense of blaspheming a Vaishnava. And in this way, his putting his feet to their head, as it might be politely said, is for their greatest benefit. So Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati gives that very nice explanation. So we're going to move from Vrindavana Thakur now over to Krishnadasa Kaviraja Goswami. Krishnadasa Kaviraja Goswami was born in Katwa. Katwa is a part of Bengal. And his mother and father, his father's name was Bhagirat, and his mother's name was Sunanda. Bhagirat and Sunanda. And so both were great devotees of Lord Chaitanya. And he actually had a brother as well. The brother's name was Shamraj or Sham Kaviraj. Let me just check. Kaviraj. Shamdas Kaviraj. Shamdas Kaviraj. So this is his brother. So in this way, very little is known about his early life, except that he was incredibly renounced, and that he didn't have any interest or attraction for any type of family life or material life. Some biographers mention that he was married and left his family early to go to Vrindavan. Some say that he was a lifelong brahmachari. But either way, we know that his level of renunciation was greatly manifested in his living in Vrindavan and in his pastimes there. Now, prior to going to Vrindavan, there's a very interesting story that he was invited, that you may remember, there's a very dear associate of Lord Nityananda called Manikatam Ramdas. And Manikatam Ramdas had this flute that he would play during the kirtans. And very, very wonderful. And when the kirtans would become particularly ecstatic, he would take this flute and occasionally slap somebody with it. And maybe sometimes he might give a big bear hug and then, give somebody a smack on the head. And, these were all in loving exchanges, not like aggressively but so this flute was his favorite instrument like this. So at any rate, they were invited one time. Krishnadasa Kaviraj was invited. He had organized a kirtan program, like a 24-hour kirtan, if you will. And he invited all these different devotees there. And so Manikatam Ramdas came, and his brother Shamdas Kaviraj was there, of course. And so it mentions that everyone was just greatly appreciating the kirtan, particularly the kirtan of Manikatam Ramdas, with the exception of this one devotee named Gunarnava Mishra. And Gunarnava Mishra began to insult the devotees there. It was really not very nice. And Ramdas, when he heard these insulting words, because Gunarnava Mishra was the family priest, and he had an actually elevated position. And when Manikatam Ramdas heard these words, he said, just see, here is a second Romaharshan Sutta. Now, those of you that are well-versed may remember that Romaharshan Sutta was at the forest of Naimisharanya, and he was speaking on the seat of Vyasadeva to the sages. And at that time, Lord Balaram came. And when Lord Balaram came, everyone got up and rose and respected Lord Balaram, except Romaharshan. So Romaharshan Sutta thought, well, I don't have to rise, I'm sitting on the seat. So this was offensive, because, of course, Balaram's the personality of Godhead. So Balaram took a blade of kusa grass and touched him with the kusa grass, and this finished his life. So in the same way, because of his disrespect to seniors, Gunarnava Mishra was compared in this way, and he was immediately released from the service of the family and sent out. And so after he was chastised in this way, he began to argue with Krishnadasa Kaviraja. After he was sent away, the brother began to argue. And there was, the brother had a lot of appreciation for Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, but very little appreciation for Nityananda. So he began to speak of one over the other, and Krishnadasa Kaviraja Goswami stopped him. He said, you're completely wrong here. Your philosophy is comparable to the philosophy of accepting half of a hen. We know this famous parable that the hen would lay golden eggs, and so the man wanted only the back half. He wanted only the part that laid the golden eggs, because he had to feed the front part. It cost him so much money. So he didn't want that part. So Krishnadasa Kaviraja Goswami said to his brother, he said, this is like the philosophy of accepting half of a hen. So in this way, there was a great disagreement in the family and a great uproar, and it was very unpleasant. Manikatam Ramdas broke his flute. You can imagine how angry a musician has to be to break his flute. He broke his flute, and he left the place. And Krishnadasa Kaviraja felt so badly. So he went to bed that night, and in his dream, and that night while he was sleeping, he had a dream, and in that dream, Nityananda Ram himself appeared to him. And the description is given very, very detailedly in Sri Chaitanya Charitamrita. I believe actually, yes, there's a very wonderful description. I'm going to read this here. Actually, I don't have that. I have a different one. But I know this one. This is one of my favorite pastimes. That when Krishnadasa Kaviraja Goswami had Lord Nityananda appear to, it mentions that Lord Nityananda appeared to him dressed in a blue dhoti with a blue silken chadar and a turban on his head, and a wonderfully fragrant garland hanging from his neck down to his knees and swaying back and forth. And it was surrounded by the bumblebees. Not only the bumblebees who were attracted to the garland, but the bumblebee-like devotees of Lord Nityananda that were attracted to his lotus feet. And it mentions that there were chamara fanners on either side of him, and that Nityananda had this beautiful complexion, and he was chewing betel and had this beautiful reddish appearance in his mouth. And in this way he looked so wonderful. And he said to Krishnadasa Kaviraja, get up, go to Vrindavan, for by going to Vrindavan you will attain all good fortune. And then he disappeared. So in this way, Krishnadasa Kaviraja, he awoke the next day, that night after the dream, and he immediately prepared and left for Vrindavan. And he went to Vrindavan, and when he arrived in Vrindavan, all the devotees, as we mentioned previously, this was when Rupa and Sanatan were still alive. Bhugarbha Goswami was there, Lokanath Goswami was there, Sanatan, Raghunath Das Goswami, Raghunath Bhatta, Jiva Goswami, Kashishwar Pandit, all these devotees were there. And Haridas was a devotee, not Haridas Thakur, but a devotee, Haridas was there. And what they were doing was they were regularly reading at the Govindaji temple. They would go in front of Govinda deity, and they would read the pastimes of Vrindavan Das Thakur's Chaitanya Bhagavat. And hearing all these wonderful pastimes of Lord Chaitanya, but then they were always hankering, what about the latter pastimes? They're not mentioned. So in this way, it was encouraged that Krishnadasa Kaviraja, he was requested by all the Vaishnavas. He was particularly requested. He took initiation when he was in Vrindavana from Raghunath Goswami. And Raghunath Goswami, as you may remember, lived out at Radhakund, not in Vrindavana proper. And Krishnadasa Kaviraja Goswami lived there also. And he lived a very, very renounced and austere life. But when the devotees began understanding his ability, excuse me, they requested that he should write the Chaitanya Charitamrita, and his own guru Raghunath Das Goswami asked him also to do so. Instead of thinking, this is what I was talking about at the beginning of the broadcast about an author, instead of thinking, well, certainly I can write this, let me just get a pen and paper and get to it. I mean, after all, you know, I can do this, not a problem. His mood was quite the opposite. First of all, he made sure that all the Vrindavan Vaishnavas wanted him to do so. And once being assured of this, all right. Then he went to, to the deity of Madan Mohan. First he went to the deity of Govindaji, and he requested. Then he went to the deity of Madan Mohan, and he asked, please, you give me your blessings that I may write this pastimes of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu as the devotees have encouraged me. And upon that request being given, it mentions the garland fell from the deities. Now, this is a very important thing. It's mentioned in the, oh, I'm trying to remember. I think it's the Hari Bhakti Vilas, but I'm not positive. One of the Vaishnava Shastras dealing with deity worship, that when the garland of the deity or a flower falls from the deity, at the time of making a prayer or a request of the Lord, it should be understood that that is granted. That's the Lord's agreement. I wish I could remember where I read that now. At any rate. So in this way, Krishnadasa Kaviraja Goswami understood that, yes, now the Lord has blessed me as well. So he very carefully looked at the pastimes written by Lochan and Vrindavana dasa Thakura, because he mentions he did not want to be repetitious and cause the voluminous nature of the Chaitanya Charitamrita to become even bigger. Already it's a 17-volume book, and he didn't want it to become more and more so. So he, as you read, there's a little bit of lighter presentation of the early pastimes. They're given, but a little bit quickly. And then the Madhya Lila, there's great emphasis on the Madhya Lila, because this is the pastimes that were not mentioned so much in the previous works. And these are very, very detailedly given from Sarup Damodar, who was the personality that primarily gave him his notes, because as you remember, Sarup Damodar was there for these pastimes of the Lord in Puri and traveling like that. And so these were the source material that he used for this. And eventually, of course, he completed the work. He mentions in his own writings that I'm very old and feeble now. Krishnadasa Kaviraja Goswami lived to be about 96 or 97 years old, and he was quite elderly already when he began the writing of the Chaitanya Charitamrita. So in this way, he several times speaks about his inability and his questioning himself, will I be able to complete this work? I'm so old and aged and fragile, will I actually be able to complete this work before, you know, my life finishes? And so in this way, he actually does complete it. There's a very nice description I want to finish this with, and that's the character, the qualities of Krishnadasa Kaviraja Goswami. This describes here, by associating with Krishnadasa Kaviraja Goswami, an eternally liberated associate of Lord Chaitanya, one has the opportunity to develop the Vaishnava qualities of humility, innocence, integrity, equanimity, gentleness, purity, selflessness, patience, kindness, gravity, freedom from material desires, mild temperament, control over the 6 passions, friendliness, honoring of all beings, being silent, expert, poetic, and total surrender to Sri Krishna. So these are the qualities that are present in the activities and in the pastimes of Krishnadasa Kaviraja Goswami. He describes himself in the Chaitanya Charitamrita, what I'm writing is like the repetition of a parrot. I write simply as Madan Gopal orders me, just as a wooden marionette is made to dance by a puppeteer. I particularly like this verse because it reminds me of the prayer that Srila Prabhupada offered in his humility when he arrived in America. We just celebrated this a weekend or two ago, 2 Sundays ago, was the anniversary of Prabhupada's arrival in America. And Prabhupada wrote in his prayer, make me dance, O Lord, make me dance. He was describing how the residents of America, the Kali Yuga residents of America, were completely in the modes of passion and ignorance and had no taste for spiritual life and had no higher principles of human living, as anybody of culture, genuine culture, would understand. And yet he said, you brought me here, you have made arrangement for me to come, now make me dance, oh my Lord, make me dance. And this is the same mood that we see in this prayer here, written by Krishnadasa Kaviraja Goswami. Just as a wooden marionette is made to dance by the puppeteer, in this case the puppeteer being Madan Gopal. So these 3 individuals, we have a great appreciation for their combining together in their own separate ways, presenting different areas of the pastimes of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, and really giving us an opportunity to enter into his life. Lochan dasa Thakura in his Chaitanya Mangala, Vrindavana dasa Thakura in his Chaitanya Bhagavat, and Krishnadasa Kaviraja Goswami in his Sri Chaitanya Charitamrita. We have all of those books available. Fortunately, the Chaitanya Charitamrita was given to us originally by Srila Prabhupada. He made sure to get this translated before his departure from this world. And we're very fortunate because, as it mentions in the descriptions of their lives, Krishnadasa Kaviraja Goswami's Chaitanya Charitamrita is much more steeped in philosophy and doctrine and teachings of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, which is what Srila Prabhupada wanted to be sure that we got the understanding of. And with that, we'll finish tonight, another night in the lives of the Vaishnava Acharyas. Hare Krishna.